Hi, this is John Romano, and this is a lecture from my course on medieval history entitled Strength and Weakness in the Holy Roman Empire. And here in this lecture, I'm going to be using the term Holy Roman Empire, which is a term that was not really used itself in the Middle Ages until quite late in the Middle Ages. As we'll see in some of the coming maps, it is roughly the same as what modern Germany is. The title Emperor had entered the bloodstream of Western Europe again when Charlemagne was crowned. But as we'll see, we'll talk about the different emperors who rule in Germany from this period. And in particular, we're going to look at the three major dynasties of the Holy Roman Empire. First, the Ottonians. Second, the Salians. And third, the Hohenstaufens. And with this image here, what you see is an image of Otto I, a statue of Otto I, who was the person who really gives the name to this dynasty. And of course, it would also, many people would say, was the first great figure in this dynasty, the first great emperor. We really attribute to him the founding of this strong form of kingship in the Holy Roman Empire. In one form or another, this is going to be an extremely long-lasting form of government. It would last until 1806, although as we'll see, it is certainly not always as powerful. We had said previously that Otto really comes to power by fending off some of those invasions we had spoken about earlier. These invasions that would come from the east by the Magyars, the ancestors of modern-day Hungarians. And here you see one medieval rendition of the Battle of Lechfeld. And Otto I would lead his forces against the Magyars in 955 and successfully vanquish them. After this point, we don't think that Otto had any intention of allowing himself to just be first among equals with other great nobles in Germany, and he wanted to build upon the success of his victory in war. And one of the ways we know he did this is he went to Aachen, the old imperial seat under Charlemagne, shown here in this image, and he insisted on being both crowned and anointed as the emperor. Then he turned to crushing any rebellious nobles in Germany who still wished to hold out against him and not recognize his authority. One of the real substantial foundations of Otto I's ability to rule was that he would gain the support of the church. He consistently would refer to himself and have members of the church refer to him as something of a sacred figure. Remember, someone who had also undergone an anointment that it looks very similar to the anointment of confirmation. And we really think that Otto I plays this to the full. We can see one of the practical implications of this is Otto I ends up getting members of the church, bishops in particular, involved with government. In many cases, in different places in his empire, he would have bishops hold the right of government over their own lands. He would also have those same bishops make sure to supply Otto with any soldiers he would need to be able to fight wars. Now, the obvious question is, why bishops? Why were they so important in this new scheme of power? The answer is very simply that bishops did not have children, or at any rate, they didn't have legitimate children. And what this meant was, when the bishops died, their power would revert directly back to the emperor, and then the emperor could simply hand out the land again to another bishop. So there wasn't that fear that the emperor would lose control of the land at any point. At first, we think that Otto, shown here with his wife, His power was confined largely to northern Germany, but in time he's going to begin to cast his eye further south. And in fact, some of the nobles in Germany are really begin to get greedy to expand their power into the areas of northern Italy known as Lombardy. And for Otto, really, the fear was then that this would actually allow them a power base to one day challenge Otto. And so Otto figured that the easiest way to combat this problem was to himself round up his soldiers and then invade Lombardy, and really use that same kind of system in which he was dependent upon the cooperation of bishops to be able to rule it. And you can see here again, this is the region of Lombardy, and in pink up above, the core of the empire of Otto I. When Otto begins to enter into Italy, what it means, of course, is that he increasingly is going to get into contact with the Pope. And in fact, he's actually at a time when the papacy itself had very little independence and was dominated by local nobles. We're going to see that Otto actually is going to end up choosing some popes much in the same way as he would choose bishops in the rest of his realm. Excuse me, because of his overwhelming power. This is one of the crowns of the Ottonians here. One of the interesting parts too about Otto and the other people in the Ottonian dynasty, this important dynasty in Germany, is that they're going to promote a period of learning. Again, kind of taking a page from the Book of Charlemagne. Much as they were crowned and anointed at Aachen, we're also going to see now that the Ottonians are going to funnel all kinds of money into learning and culture. And some people have actually referred to this along the same lines as the previous accomplishments of the Carolingians. That was the Carolingian Renaissance, and they're going to refer to this one as the Ottonian Renaissance. And here we can just look at a few of the kinds of productions or works that came out of this Renaissance. There is a good deal of metalwork, as is with this cross. There's a lot of manuscript illumination. Here's another good example of that trend. We know that there's a lot of ivories. Here is a carving of Otto and his family. It says Otto Emperor. Here's another ivory. This is actually a font for holy water, but you can see that it is remarkably well carved. And here again is a good example with Jesus in the center and the symbols of the four gospel writers around the sides. Here's another manuscript illumination. Again, some of these are really luxurious products, in some cases using gold leaf for illumination. Many cases, some of the artwork of the Ottonian Renaissance would hail back to ancient models, and in some cases even using some products from old ancient works. One of the major artists who would produce her works during the Ottonian Renaissance is this 10th century nun, Benedictine, known as Heratsvit. Heratsvit would write in the major language of learning at the time, Latin, and she would write poems, dramas, and epics. And although she had chosen this form that was very well known in the ancient world, instead of speaking about some of the great heroes of the ancient world, she instead wrote stories that were especially keyed to women and would often have women as the protagonists in them. In many cases, this involved transforming some of the lives of female saints into a much more dramatic sort of mode. She spoke about things characters like virgins, repentant prostitutes, and people who call upon God in some cases to preserve them and to preserve their chastity. So, for instance, there's one story in which one of these characters called upon God to protect her against a would-be rapist, and God causes him to go blind. Hrotsvit is also a very good example of a historian's error. She actually ends up narrating the rise of the Ottonians and also the foundation story of her own monastery. So she's a history writer as well. After Otto I's death, we don't think that the other Ottonian emperors, in spite of still, as you can see, supporting the arts, they were not able to have the same luck or the same success as he did in life. And this was for several different reasons. We're going to see that later Ottonian emperors are going to experience a major rebellion by one of the nobles in Bavaria in southern Germany. We're also going to see a devastating defeat by one of the armies of the Ottonians by Muslims in southern Italy. Around the same time, too, there's going to be an uprising of some of the Slavic peoples in the eastern part of the empire. This is going to end up actually causing a massacre of some German colonists and missionaries who had traveled over to the east. We're also going to see, especially by Otto III, he's going to make a failed attempt at trying to make the city of Rome the center of his power. I see here Roma as the fourth of these symbolic representations of different parts of the Ottonians' empire. The problem with attempting to make Rome the center of the power, an idea that really had been inspired by all sorts of ancient models, was that the Ottonians had absolutely no base of power there, and local Italian aristocrats hated the interference of Germans there. In effect, the Ottonians could temporarily scare people with their military might, but they had no hope of staying there for very long. Altogether, too, we see as the Ottonian dynasty begins to unravel, especially the northern German parts begin to break away on their own until essentially they lose all control over them. Interestingly enough, then, this is only logical, is in fact some of those northern German territories that would actually end up forming the core of a new and the second dynasty we're discussing here in the Holy Roman Empire, known as the Salian dynasty. And in this dynasty, we can see a pronounced shift of power into northern Germany. This dynasty would start with the monarch you see here, the Emperor Conrad II, who was kind of a rough and tumble soldier. In some degree, he faced the greatest success, or encountered the greatest success under this dynasty. He, for instance, was able to seize the area of Burgundy through a very weak claim that his wife had over the land. He ended up attacking some of the areas in the Slavic areas, what today is modern-day Poland, and forced them to accept him as being their lord. Interestingly enough, too, we see that Conrad II did not have a whole lot of faith in nobles remaining loyal to him, and so what he decided to do was often make very low-born people his officials, his civil service, with the goal, of course, of finding people who were only loyal to him, that had no major links to the nobility. We also can see that Conrad II, being a military man, really thought very carefully about where to build castles, to be able to put his men there, to be able to enforce his local power on the ground. This is obviously not a castle, but one of the churches that was built under Conrad. Conrad II's power was based upon, first of all, the hope that all of the nobles of Germany eventually would fold before the steady growth of royal power. The second was that members of the church, and bishops in particular, would always find in their interest to remain loyal to the emperor. And in effect, he ends up being mistaken in both of these assumptions. And this real sort of these problems that the Salians begin to encounter really come to a head during the reign of one emperor whose time we've already discussed in this class, and that is the reign of Henry IV. And we've already spoken at great length about the prolonged war that Henry IV would fight against Pope Gregory VII. And we of course have spoken about the larger repercussions of this war for the battle of church and state, the relationship between the two of them. But we've discussed less about what the implications were for the investiture controversy when it came to the government of the Holy Roman Empire. And what we really see is that this investiture controversy would kill the support of the state on the church. And the problem would really become that bishops were no longer directly appointed by emperors. In effect, we saw during the investiture controversy, the emperor could no longer even be certain that bishops would remain loyal to him while he was excommunicated. We really see, too, that when Henry IV got into trouble with the church, some of the nobles decided that this was the perfect opportunity to throw off their allegiance to him. This break was so sustained, both the sort of problems with bishops and nobles, that some people would say that already in this dynasty, this was the turning point, that after which the Holy Roman Empire would never achieve the kind of centralized power that it had previously held. So by the time you get to the last of the Salians, we see a considerable loss of power. We really think that although you may think of this as a negative for some of the nobles of Germany, some of them seem to actually be happy that the Salians were losing all of their power. When the Salians died out, they, rather than electing someone who is the most powerful person who might be able to consolidate authority, instead they end up passing over many of these people to allow nobles within Germany to further consolidate their own independent power. And the old nightmare that the German emperors had, that the nobles could take areas of land and office and simply pass them down from father to son. Well, this nightmare finally came true. What we see then is that many of these important nobles would end up collecting all sorts of other nobles who were loyal to them. In essence, they became lords, and they would end up enlisting their own vassals, their own men. And so, in some ways, we actually see something of a repetition of a variation of the kind of feudalism that we had seen elsewhere, in which, yes, there is certainly still a German emperor around, but increasingly he did not have the same level of power. There's a certain level of devolution of power. The one danger for the nobles, the one thing they wanted to avoid, however, was that their complete anarchy would really break out. And we don't think that most of the nobles really wanted internal confusion. What they wanted to do was consolidate the gains of their own power, have really rule their own territory with an iron fist, but they didn't want the same level of all sorts of low-level nobles running around gaining power that had occurred, for instance, in France. So they still wanted someone who could maintain order, but not someone who would seriously disrupt their own business. And that leads them eventually to elect the first emperor of the last of the three dynasties we're discussing, referred to as the Hohenstaufen dynasty. And this emperor that we're discussing is known as Friedrich I, Friedrich Barbarossa, a name that means red beard. And you can see from this illumination, indeed, he did have a red beard. Friedrich I was well connected to noble families at the time in Germany, and most people tend to think he proved himself to be a great statesman. Upon coming to power, we really think that Friedrich I had one of two options. If he chose, he could try to go and regain authority in northern Germany, a lot of which had really slipped out of the hands of the German emperor. This was an unattractive option, we think, in his eyes, because what it meant, in essence, was that he was actually going to go to war with many of his own relatives, and this was unappealing. The other option, and this is the option that he really decides on, was that Friedrich I would turn to the south, to areas of Burgundy and Italy, where he could really begin to build up all sorts of power for himself. Now, this is not to say he entirely neglected some of the nobles of Germany. He forced them to do that ritual submission of homage that we've talked about before. They had to recognize him as their appropriate lord. But we really see that, to some degree, Friedrich I decides to give them free rein to deal with lesser lords in their own areas. Friedrich also would marry very cleverly. He would marry to gain Burgundy again. Then he used his armies to march into Lombardy. And at that point, he decided to force the people there to recognize his lordship, and he could begin to take taxes from some of these Italian cities. In most cases, he was not in direct control of them. He did not directly absorb them into his territory, but he was able to gain the money from them. And we think that to some degree, he also allowed the cities that were some of the generators of a lot of the economic well-being, he allowed them more of a free rein, where he took stronger control over areas in the countryside in Italy. Nevertheless, invading Italy means that, again, you're going to have to deal with the big dog in the fight of Italy, and that is the Pope. And the popes, they did not want anyone else to be able to unify Italy under their control, and certainly not the German emperor. And immediately we think Friedrich ends up getting into all sorts of arguments with the Pope. When they first met, for instance, there was this curious debate over whether or not Friedrich I would hold the reins of the Pope's horse, which he felt, and perhaps quite rightly, would tend to reinforce a symbolism that he was somehow lesser than the Pope, or a servant of the Pope. Well, people on the papal side just felt that it was an appropriate ritual that secular rulers were supposed to do with the Pope. There was also a major misinterpretation of some of the documents that went back and forth some of which seem to imply that Friedrich I only held onto his land as a fief from the Pope, which was surely not an understanding that the emperor or his men would have appreciated. Eventually, in desperation, the Pope would end up supporting something known as the Lombard League, which was a federation of northern Italian cities who would go to war with the German emperor. There were years of small skirmishes at first with Friedrich I, and then finally a great battle in which the Germans were routed by the Italians. Friedrich would then negotiate a truce, and he would have slightly better relations with the Pope. We think, though, that some of the problems that Friedrich ran into in Italy were directly a result of the kind of difficulties he had faced in Germany. And to show you what a free rein that many of his own nobles felt, they simply had refused to send any troops to support him against the Lombard League, although that actually was their obligation, their sworn obligation to him. They just did not emerge. And we see that in this time where Friedrich's power is being challenged, some of his nobles actually begin to seize church property on their own. Another case, Friedrich then would have to use his power to simply begin to attack some of his nobles who had gotten out of control. Friedrich then would again turn his attention back to Italy, and this time he just chose to use diplomacy over war. And he ends up actually making a settlement with the Lombard League, in which the cities would remain autonomous, but in essence, they would have to end up paying money to the emperor, a certain amount of money, for their independence. And in effect, some of his own, the German emperor's own officials would remain within the cities. We think that to some degree, too, Friedrich also begins to make some military movements further into central Italy. Altogether, what this meant was that Friedrich had a new empire. It was not really a very strong empire in some way. It was really a somewhat weak German core with appendages in areas both to the west and to the south. As for Friedrich I, his end is somewhat strange altogether. Friedrich, like many people in his age, as we've discussed, ended up becoming fascinated with the ideal of going on crusade. And actually, he starts leading what's known as the Third Crusade. And it really initially looked like an extremely promising crusade. But it appears that while he was swimming, he ended up suffering a heart attack and died. Just to let you know, monarchs did not actually go swimming with their crowns on. This is just meant to identify who it is who's swimming here. Perhaps the most interesting of the later Hohenstaufen emperors was this man pictured here, Friedrich II. Friedrich II, both by modern historians and also by contemporaries, has always been something of a fascinating figure. Strange for someone who was a Holy Roman Emperor, he actually ended up having a weak connection to Germany. He, as a boy, was regarded as a foreigner and really having very close papal relations. And he actually had grown up in Sicily, not in Germany at all. And so his power base initially was actually Italy and not Germany. And German nobles at first were very, very hesitant to support him at all. And in fact, they ended up at first electing two other kings, one of whom ended up being assassinated. before finally allowing Friedrich II to take up his position. Friedrich II would end up marrying a Spanish princess. He enlisted knights from Spain then to help him in some of his expeditions, including gaining control of Sicily from local Italian nobles. We also know the other rival for Friedrich II ended up actually losing battle in France, which is why in many cases the nobles felt that they had absolutely no choice eventually but to go with Friedrich, who at least had some success up until this point. When Friedrich II ends up taking the position of emperor, he has as part of his lands territory in Germany, in Italy, in Sicily, and really in one fell swoop, the greatest fears of the Pope were realized. He was surrounded by a king in both southern and northern Italy. And although, again, really the reputation Friedrich had when he was young as being someone who was close to the Pope, he ends up actually becoming one of the most dangerous enemies of the papacy altogether. Again, very strange for a German emperor. Not only had Friedrich grown up outside of Germany, but he didn't really particularly like Germany all that well. He seemed to find Germany cold, damp, and gloomy, a place that had a bunch of swamps and forests. And it is fair to say Germany did have a bit more swamps and forests back then than it does right now. But this negative attitude towards Germany had practical implications. He really ends up staying in the northern part of his own kingdom only long enough to get it organized, and get it organized so well that it would need no further attention to him from his part. And he would only return after that for brief visits. Rather than going to war with some of these princes, he basically gave them everything that they asked for. And at this point, we see that the fiefs that nobles hold become fully hereditary. The nobles can simply give them to their own sons without any sort of approval by the emperor. German nobles will also gain complete powers of jurisdiction. They have the right to hold court, and they have the right to find and execute men or other sort of judicial settlements against them. Before I go on, I should note that part of the fascination with Friedrich was not only that he came to power in something of a very bizarre way, but we think that he was a highly educated and intelligent person. He was himself a poet, and he was a patron of other poets. And he was brought up in Sicily, which really allowed him to become deeply connected to Muslim culture of his own time, far more than the vast majority of Western Europeans at the time. And supposedly in Sicily, he grew up among wealth and splendor, including creating his own imperial zoo. Rumors circulated at his time to show just how different he was from other rulers, that he had a harem that was filled with Muslim beauties. And he, in reality, too, he had Muslim guards. Friedrich II was also somewhat less devout than most monarchs of his time. He was reputed to have said something along the lines that the world has known three great fakers, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, which he is so out of step with the vast majority of people at the time that some people have found it very hard to believe that he actually said it. Well, we know that Friedrich II wanted to build Italy into a new centralized state that would be dominated by Sicily. To be able to do this, the first problem the emperor ran into is that he had to gain the Pope's favor. And as we said, this had been very difficult because the Pope had no intention of allowing the German Emperor to unify Italy under him. The way Friedrich II initially attempted to get in the Pope's good graces was to promise to go on crusade. And also, as a sign of his good faith, he gave back certain central Italian lands that had been in the hands of the German Emperor since Friedrich Barbarossa. The Pope then, seeing that the two were becoming allies, or at least apparently becoming allies, the Pope ended up crowning him as emperor and anointing him. But immediately the Pope really regretted this decision because Friedrich II didn't fulfill his promise. He will actually decide, the Pope will decide to excommunicate Friedrich II. Now, the reason Friedrich II didn't go off on crusade immediately was because he was suffering from a case of the plague, which you might think is a pretty good excuse, but the Pope was fed up with him. When Friedrich II recovers, he actually does choose to head off into the Middle East to go on crusade, bizarrely without being reconciled with the Church. So we actually have an emperor who was excommunicated, who was going on holy war. This is not something that normally happens. Friedrich II also ends up settling the crusade in a very different way than many rulers of his time. His first action upon arriving in the Middle East was simply to march his very impressive army around. The Sultan of Egypt, shown here on the right, was really the primary target of this new crusade, in part because Egypt was at the time the center of Muslim power, but he also held on to the key aim of the Crusaders, the city of Jerusalem. The Sultan of Egypt decided, after having seen this army, that he really wanted no piece of it, and he decided to sit down at the negotiating table. And through this process, Friedrich II actually ended up getting Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. And Christians and Muslims both had freedom of religion in Jerusalem. And you might think that this was the best of all possible world. Here was a crusade settled by peaceful means rather than by war. But in fact, many of his contemporaries were disgusted that he had decided to negotiate with Muslims. In fact, he was pelted by all sorts of rotten meat as he left Jerusalem, thrown by Christians. What was even worse was that while Friedrich II was away on this bizarre crusade, the Pope decided that this would be a wonderful opportunity to invade his territory in Italy. And so Friedrich, far from being able to savor his diplomatic successes, had to rush very quickly back to Italy to be able to face a papal army. Ultimately, this was not much of a challenge for Friedrich II. He easily defeats the papal army, and he compels the Pope to make peace with him. After that, Friedrich II turned his attention to subjugating Lombardy. But once again, the Lombard League was reformed, this again with papal encouragement. The Pope decided to once again excommunicate Friedrich II. And for a period of time, Friedrich II, who now was getting fed up with the Pope, actually even contemplating attacking Rome itself, which he decided would be too difficult. On the whole, Friedrich II would win many individual battles in the Italian north, but he really could never win the war. His resources were simply not sufficient to defeat the Lombard League in the field, and it was really just too costly to constantly reduce all walled towns one by one. Most historians would say that Friedrich II's death marked a change in power in Germany. It's the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, but really, some would say this really would be the end of powerful German kings or emperors altogether. And so most people would say that in effect the crown, the king, had little power past this point. And without any serious check against their authority, nobles in Germany really became complete masters of the realm. And they decided that they had no intention of permitting a revival of effective royal authority, which they thought ultimately, and quite rightly, would end up checking their own authority in their own realm. So for all practical terms, Germany really was not a single state, much less a nation. But instead, what you end up seeing was a loose alliance of nobles under the vague power of an elected king. And the power, in fact, was very limited altogether. And what we'll see then is that between the 13th and the 15th century, Germany would become a conglomeration of virtually independent states under a host of different nobles. Here I'm showing you the map from what quote-unquote Germany looked like in the year 1789. And eventually Germany will be as many as 1,600 individual units, ranging in size from ones that are relatively large to those that are completely tiny and uninfluential. And in fact, most German states at some point would become too small to exercise even temporary hegemony over other ones. Nobles would incessantly feud with one another and go to battle with one another. Some historians, in fact, have argued that the basic idea of these small territorial realms, these principalities, was really not to centralize power at all, but they're kind of incubators. The attitude was that they existed to preserve the authority of whatever noble was empowered. But the problem was that once this process of splintering without any sort of unification begins, it never quite ends. And so in many cases you got what some of the previous nobles had feared. You get anarchy in some of these small territories. And for those who are looking toward the future, this state of affairs, which, as you can see, begins as medieval phenomenon, is the reason why Germany would not come together as a single unified country until the 19th century. So the roots of this problem begin in medieval Germany. Still, you should not forget that even in this time period, in which Germany as a whole has trouble politically, there is still considerable vitality among Germans, but you just can't necessarily look to it in some of these core lands we've been discussing. And what is interesting to us is that, as we've mentioned earlier when we talked about the Crusades that happened in Eastern Europe, that the heroes of these campaigns, the Teutonic Knights, ended up really continuing to lead a very strong field of operation against pagan Slavs beyond German borders. And Friedrich II will grant the territory of Eastern Prussia to the Master General of the Order of the Teutonic Knights. Gradually, the Teutonic Knights then will occupy more and more lands to the east. They begin to attack the pagan inhabitants, for instance, of modern-day Lithuania, Poland, and the Balkans. Really, they really using a page from the same book that we've spoken about earlier. At this point, these peoples were in some cases exterminated. In other cases, they were converted at the point of the sword. In other cases, they were just driven off. And then their territory would be held by German settlers. So there's really a spread of the people of Germany to the east as well. Really, you will see in this period that Prussia actually becomes German and Christian, and the Teutonic Knights will push, for instance, into the Balkans. As I mentioned earlier, some of these campaigns were certainly brutal in the way that they were carried out. But it was no doubt, though, that even as some of the territories within Germany were becoming less settled, there was something of a safety valve for those who still wanted expansion, and probably in the East a greater sense of unification as well. Great. Thank you.